Good morning, my dear friends, and welcome to another episode of Reading Epic Threads. I'm your host, Patrick Gunnels, joining you from Houston, Texas, this March 8th, 2025 at 7:21 a.m. Central Standard Time. This will be our very last day of Standard Time when we travel around 2 a.m. into the dark midnight of daylight time, the hellhole, the circadian rhythm shattering custom that we go through like imbeciles every single year. And this year we only get 4 months of standard time. Now, I would advise everybody simply to tell the people who control the clocks to bug off, but I don't think that's going to happen. And if it has to be permanent daylight time, so be it, but it should be permanent standard time. My wife and I agree. John Morrison agrees. Anne Rain agrees. These are very obvious things. We should have permanent standard time. With that in mind, I want to remind all of you that we recently were out of stock of the amazing Castor Blend and the amazing Body Butters, but they are now back in stock at tulipblooms.shop, where you can get every flavor of Castor Blend. You can get the unscented. You can get the core essential blend, which is a mixture of tea tree, rose geranium, lavender, rosemary, and patchouli. I think I got them all this time. And then, of course, the carrier oils in it are 40% castor oil, and then argan oil, apricot kernel oil, amaranth oil. Good luck finding virgin organic amaranth oil that hasn't been jacked with, guys. I've got several sources, and believe me, you have to buy a lot at one time to get your hands on it. And then, of course, we have the amazing sea buckthorn fruit oil straight from the mountains of the Himalayas, containing one of the richest supplies of omega-7 fatty acid in all of nature. It mimics the natural moisture of your skin in ways that nothing else in nature can. And the castor oil delivers it like you would not believe. The Castor Blend will change your life, as it has many others. And don't forget the rainfall, and don't forget the fact that we have it in multiple scents, including unscented. All right, now let's do our show. From badlands.substack.com, is Generation X saving America? Examining the sociopolitical makeup of the rebel generation, by Eric Carlson. Generation X refers to Americans born between 1965 and 1979. Gen X are currently between the ages of 45 and 60 and represent about 60 million of the American population, one of the smaller generations. Gen X is considered in their prime earning years today and represents over half of American CEOs. Much of the innovation and technology we rely on today comes from the minds and the work of this generation. The latchkey generation, or rather, the original latchkey generation. Every generation after X could be considered a latchkey generation. Generation X was the first generation of kids commonly to come home from school to an empty house or apartment. In many cases, both parents worked and the kids were required to be on their own for 2 to 3 hours until their parents got home from work. For 2 or 3 hours, many kids could do whatever they wanted, unsupervised. No doorbell camera watching them come and go, or a phone tracker to see where they are. Nothing. They could raid the pantry, making themselves a bowl of top ramen, or grab a bag of Doritos before plopping down in front of the TV to watch an old episode of Gilligan's Island or the Flintstones if they were older Gen X, or maybe Saved by the Bell if they were younger Gen X. A boy's afternoon could be spent hanging out on a street corner with his friends if he lived in a city, at a 7-Eleven if he lived in the suburbs, or in the woods if he lived in the country. If he hung out with the wrong people, he could find himself in trouble with the law, or the laws of nature, as in Evel Knievel like bike ramps or 3-story high rope swings. Why were so many kids left to fend for themselves after school? The answer to this is easy. Divorce rates drastically increased and more mothers entered the workforce. During the 1960s and early 1970s, the women's movement took off, a movement led by CIA assets like Gloria Steinem encouraged women to leave their husbands and or join the workforce. The traditional family structure and the desire to attain a traditional family were no longer goals in an increasing number of Americans' minds. Stay-at-home moms were now viewed as second-class citizens by many within the movement. With the mass influx of women into the workforce in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, the cost of living took off, especially the cost of housing. In some cases, families who preferred the traditional family model were forced to have two working parents just to make ends meet. I would argue that the women's movement benefited women the least, while the civil rights movement benefited blacks the least. Whom did they benefit the most? The banking industry, the real estate industry, as well as the retail and service industries, the second income or two households meant the cost of living could and would go up. Both the women's and civil rights movements were heavily orchestrated by the FBI and the CIA. There was nothing organic about either of them. I'm not arguing that every human being doesn't deserve to be treated equally, just that these two movements in particular were cabal-run psyops. In the 1950s, the divorce rate for Americans was 2.5 out of every 1,000 Americans. By the end of the 1960s, that rate went up to 3.2 out of every 1,000 Americans. By the 1970s, 50% of all marriages that started during that decade ended in divorce. The latchkey generation was born. America would never be the same. One could even say this led to the explosion of the processed food and fast food industries in America that became commonplace in the 1970s. Families now relied on convenience. Generation X could be considered the first generation of children to face the trauma of divorce and broken homes, all while processed foods became the bulk of their diet. The first generation to be raised by TV. They could also be viewed as the last generation to avoid the LGBTQ movement that is said to have spawned in 1969, but didn't really hit its stride until most within Gen X were adults. Also, Gen X were the last generation not to be influenced by the internet and social media as children. The human brain doesn't fully develop until age 25, which means Gen X brains became fully developed between 1990 and 2004. In my opinion, Gen X avoided many contrived and orchestrated movements during their influential years. Traumatic events like 9/11 happened in 2001. The trans movement didn't come until 2012, and the COVID narrative didn't occur until 2020, all while most of Gen X were well into their adult years. One could argue that Gen X's influential developmental years happened during a pocket of time when the propagandization of American society was in remission. In 1981, when Ronald Reagan became president, Gen X was between 2 and 16 years of age, highly influential years. When he left office 8 years later, Gen X was between 10 and 24 years of age. Donald Trump could be considered Reagan 2.0. Both bring and brought a sense of pride in America and a belief that real change could and can occur. But while Reagan looked to subdue the deep state, Trump is planning to completely annihilate it. Reagan tried to make deals with the deep state, while Trump has shown more of a reluctance to make similar mistakes. Reagan was naive to believe deals could be made with evil people, going as far as accepting former CIA Director George Bush as his vice president, almost leading to his ultimate demise. After Reagan's election, the deep state fought back to dampen the spirit that was igniting in Americans everywhere. A month after The 1980 election, John Lennon was murdered on the streets of Manhattan, which sounds familiar to today's events in timing and details. The murder of Lennon affected the baby boomers the most. He was a childhood idol to many of this generation. It makes me wonder, did John Lennon and Yoko Ono go into hiding in the years prior to his murder? Did Lennon decide he no longer wanted to participate in the cabal system that made him famous? Did he become a threat to the cabal? 2 months after taking office, the deep state tried to assassinate Reagan and replace him with their puppet, George Bush. Gen X had never known a POTUS that was shown any respect by the media. Surviving the assassination, Reagan became like an indestructible grandpa figure to many in Gen X, but still, fear needed to be created. The day after, a made-for-TV movie about the nuclear destruction of America came out in 1983. This would instill fear into the youth, but only for a short time. The following year, the Los Angeles Olympics of 1984 occurred, generating hope and American pride throughout American society. At this time, everything changed as music became upbeat and positive. Movie heroes were more masculine. TV sitcoms became the norm. The economy changed. Everything became less dark, less bleak. Literally, as even fluorescent colors became a fad. Movies like Rambo replaced The Deer Hunter. American Strength replaced American Weakness. The Cosby Show replaced Good Times. Blacks were no longer portrayed as poor and struggling. Vacation replaced Kramer versus Kramer. All the President's Men gave way to Red Dawn, a movie about Gen X teenagers literally defeating the commies who invaded America. The movie studios were being commissioned by the Reagan administration to make movies that inspired Americans. The 1980s are still looked upon today with happiness and cheer by all generations. I'm not saying Reagan was perfect, but rather that during his presidency, a message of positivity and pride in America was reignited. The prior decade, a message of fear and bleakness prevailed, and the decade after Reagan, things went back to a similar grungy, satanic panic darkness. The 1970s were filled with adult issues like long gas lines, inflation, unemployment, high interest rates, basically a decade-long recession. The office of the president was no longer respected or trusted. While this may have greatly affected the parents of Gen X, I don't think these issues had the same direct impact on their children. Reagan's presidency started with the release of hostages from Iran and ultimately ended with the crumbling of the Soviet Union. Quite a change from the prior decade. How is Generation X saving America then? I believe Gen X is saving America because they have avoided the brunt of the propaganda that was used so abusively on the generations that preceded and proceeded it. The whole decade of the 1960s was a psyop on the baby boomers. From the hippie counterculture to drug culture to the women's movement to the civil rights movement, all surrounding the Vietnam War, all of these movements were funded and orchestrated by the CIA to instill discord and confusion in the baby boomer generation. A generation was left confused about how to attain happiness and fulfillment and was driven to guilt if they even came close to achieving these things. Hippies transitioned to yuppies, eventually becoming Karens. What about the generations that followed Gen X? The millennial generation and Generation Z, who were raised during the time of peak political correctness, and the LGBTQ and trans movements. Millennials are now between the ages of 28 and 44, and Gen Z is between 12 and 27. The millennials were between 5 and 20 when 9/11 occurred, between 16 and 31 when the trans movement started, and 24 and 39 when the COVID narrative was unleashed on the world. Gen Z was 0 to 4 when the Twin Towers fell, 5 to 12 when transgender bathrooms became a nationwide talking point, and 8 to 23 when wearing a mask became commonplace. The age of a person when the LGBTQ and transgender movements peaked are directly correlated to how they identify sexually. 4% of baby boomers identify as LGBTQ+, followed by 7% of Gen X, 11.2% of millennials, and a whopping 19.7% of Gen Z. Identifying as trans by generation, we see 0.2% of boomers, 0.3% Gen X, 1% millennials, and 1.9% Gen Z. If being gay or trans were truly genetic, you can't account for the near doubling that occurs between the millennials and Gen Z, just one generation apart. Science would say it's not genetic. It can't be genetic. If it's not genetic, what is the alternative? It's a choice. One that is influenced heavily by society and the media. Personally, I don't care what adults identify as long as they leave the kids alone. Conveniently, science is ignored when making genetic claims about sexuality and identity. Even Charles Darwin wouldn't make that claim, that genetic evolution could occur this fast. The 2024 election. I understand that elections lie somewhere on the spectrum of being completely fake to significantly manipulated. I can't imagine anyone today still truly believes elections are safe and secure. But if you believe elections hold any merit in determining who becomes president, consider this. According to statistics from the 2024 election, 42% of Americans ages 18 to 29 voted for Trump. 46% of Americans ages 30 to 44 voted for Trump. 53% of Americans ages 45 to 64 voted for Trump. 49% of Americans age 65 plus voted for Trump. The only group that voted in a majority for Trump was the age group 45 to 64. I understand this doesn't line up perfectly with Gen X, but it's close enough. Without Gen X voting in a significant majority for Trump, Trump would not have been elected POTUS in November. One can argue Gen X voted for Trump because they are the most affected by current and future policies. The highest wage-earning group probably prefers lower taxes. The group with the most children in public schools and colleges are probably the most affected by woke policies and narratives. The group with the most leadership in business probably prefers less regulation. It makes sense why Gen X would choose Trump. But I believe it goes much deeper than all this. I believe Generation X voted for Trump because they were better able to see through the lies and propaganda in a way the generations before and after them were not. This doesn't mean there aren't awake people in every generation. This doesn't mean Gen X are smarter or more educated than the other groups, just that they were lucky enough to avoid much of the trauma and propaganda that was more heavily used on the other generations at times in their lives when they were most easily influenced. The technology used to influence and propagandize Americans has changed over the years. The internet became accessible to the general public in the 1990s. The first iPhone was released in 2007 when Gen X was between 28 and 42. Millennials were between 11 and 26, and many of Gen Z weren't even born yet. Many millennials don't remember a time before the internet, while many in Gen Z have had a smartphone since they were 5 or 6 years old. Gen X found a sweet spot with technology. They are less slaves to technology than the generations that preceded them, while still being able to use technology better than many in the generations that preceded them, giving them access to information without enslaving them to the propaganda. Ironically, Trump, as a baby boomer, is jettisoning out a group of people who are mostly baby boomers and members of the silent generation, the Obamas, the Clintons, the Bidens, Pelosi, Schumer, McConnell. The list of deep state players goes on and on. He is replacing them with a group of patriots consisting mostly of Gen X. There are a few people a little younger or older, but Trump's appointees are predominantly Gen X. This can't be a total coincidence. The timing of when this revolution occurred cannot be completely random. Donald Trump was probably ready to fight this battle decades ago, but likely had to wait for his supporting cast to be ready. The youth that were spared much of the mind-altering propaganda and conditioning are now ready to go to war. That was really a nice piece, Eric. Like, really, really good. My wife is wonderful. She just wrote me an email. An email that says, just sending you the compliments. No action needed. I don't know how I conditioned her into doing that, but I really do enjoy it when I get the, let's start you off by letting you know that this is only good. This email is from Tish Allen. And it says, yes, I watch Rambo and Friends. When Patrick pops onto the show, his insight is great. In addition to his wit and humor, makes us all smile. When he shares about tulip blooms, rubbing the castor blend on his head and explaining the benefits, well, who wouldn't want to try it? When I opened the first bottle I received about a month ago, I instantly loved the scent. But more than that, it really makes my skin feel so soft. I'm looking forward to using the body butter later today. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Blessings, Tish. Thank you so much, Tish. You're wonderful. And so is the castor blend. Sea buckthorn fruit oil, y'all. You know you want it. Don't forget rainfall. I have the rose gold infused, but we have the rose geranium infused if you really want the essential oil instead. So rose gold is a fragrance oil. It's the most natural fragrance oil we can get, but oh God, it smells freaking good. Anyway, rose gold is a fragrance oil. Fragrance oils are not entirely natural. Essential oils are taken directly from the plant, and they're fully natural. And we use only organic essential oils. So there you go. Anyway, so just remember that. Rose geranium essential oil, rose gold fragrance oil. Some people are more strict. With myself, I'm not as strict as I probably could be, because I don't think the freaking 1% fragrance oil is all that bad for me. Some people are really, really sensitive to that stuff. That's why the vast majority of our products are purely organic. Anyway, running my mouth. Go to tulipblooms.shop. That's tulipblooms.shop. I mean, for obvious reasons. It's good for your skin. And now, Erik Carlson. From ericc.substack.com. Give a Man a Fish, Trump Building Self-Reliance by Erik Carlson. This is ericc.substack.com, ERIKC. There's a saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. I actually thought this was from the Bible. I had to look it up. It's an old Chinese proverb. Whatever the case, it's full of wisdom. It's profound. It is something that needs to be remembered and applied in practice. As a parent, if you don't prepare your children to become independent as they get older, they will always be dependent on you. It's fine to have your children rely on you as their parent, their loved one, but they must be prepared to become self-sufficient. Once you push them out of the nest and into the real world, a world where they're expected to take care of themselves, to earn a living, to pay their rent, to feed themselves, and to do their laundry, and maybe eventually to start a family, they must have acquired and been taught the skills to survive mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally. Teaching self-sufficiently comes through instruction and leading by example. The work of teaching your children independence starts early on at home. If you always do for your children and never allow them the opportunities to learn and do for themselves, they will be like a house cat released into the jungle once they become adults. As much as a child thinks they would rather have their parents do everything for them, a parent knows it would be cruel to set them off on life's journey completely unprepared. The same thing could be said about the American people in general. For decades, Americans have been told what to think, what to believe, and what to do. Control through propaganda has left many Americans with an inability to survive on their own, unable to think for themselves in some cases, completely unable to have an independent thought, unable to stand on their own, afraid to go against groupthink. An abused child may become incapable of seeing the world as it truly is due to the abuse they've endured. The abuse may permanently affect how their brains work. Their brains may no longer be normal functioning brains. They can't be expected to function properly again just because the abuse has stopped. If someone was born and raised in a cult, and one day the cult leaders were arrested and the cult was disbanded, doesn't make the cult members ready or capable of moving on. Without help and time to heal, they will likely be incapable of adjusting to the real world. While they have been physically freed, mentally, they are still under the control of the cult or victims of the damage the cult leaders have inflicted on them. As many Americans wake up to lies and propaganda that have shaped their thoughts and altered their minds, being told the truth isn't always enough, isn't usually enough. As many Americans start to wake up, they are like cult members who have lost their cult. And whether or not they understand it, they are now looking for a new cult to join. Their minds aren't prepared or capable of thinking on their own, of being on their own. They want to be told what to think. The synapses and neurons aren't firing fast enough for them to process the new information they're learning. They just want to be told what to believe, to blend in with the masses. Through chronic abuse of drugs and alcohol, the addict's brain can become rewired, dopamine shut off. Smokers can eventually lose the physical craving to smoke, but may have an empty feeling that comes from not having something between their middle and index finger. It is not enough to simply shut off the propaganda machines and unlock the doors of the mental prison. It is not enough to give a man a fish. He must be taught how to fish. I believe what we have intentionally experienced during the waking process is not simply being given a fish. We're being taught how to fish. We are being taught how to think for ourselves. Most of us have never known a time when we weren't being propagandized. Like an addict, some people's brains are rewired, unable to function properly. Everyone's brain has been affected to some degree. To deny this is like a six-pack-a-day drinker saying they don't have a drinking problem. They may be able to function. Doesn't mean they're not an alcoholic, just a functioning alcoholic. The process by which the truth has been disseminated to us is intentional. The pace at which the truth has been released to us has been calculated. As a society, we have been woken up at a pace that allows our mind's eye to adjust to the morning light. The cure can't be worse than the disease. We can't learn to swim by being pushed into the deep end of the pool. This may work for some, but for others, it results in death. Some people complain that the truth hasn't been released to the American people fast enough. I would argue, for some at least, this would be the equivalent of transferring a drug overdose patient from an emergency room straight to a crack house or an opium den as soon as they regained consciousness. The overdose patient likely needs to go into rehab, followed by a halfway house, and eventually home. This process may take a few tries before it sticks. In some cases, it may never stick. The past 8 years or so has been a necessary process at a necessary pace to transition us back into society, a real society, not a new matrix-like existence. We haven't been simply given a fish. We have been taught how to fish for ourselves. We have been taught how to think for ourselves. We've been taught how to reason for ourselves. I believe the reason the propaganda machine hasn't been completely unplugged from the wall is so that we can continue to learn and become more independent. We can't simply live in a cave to be free of the mind control. We must be able to hear lies and recognize them for what they are. It took me years to understand completely what 9/11 really was and how it was used to gain control of us. It took me weeks to figure out what Benghazi was about. It took me days to recognize what COVID was and its purpose. It took me minutes to question October 7th. See the pattern? Needless to say, we have been taught to recognize the truth and to reject the lies. The pace of learning has not caused most of us to break or become black-pilled and hopeless. We have been trained to become independent. We have been taught to think for ourselves. What does thinking for ourselves mean? It means recognizing patterns. Last week, Elon Musk went on Joe Rogan's podcast and said he couldn't say too much because he feared he would be assassinated. The next week, SCOTUS ruled against Trump, allowing USAID to continue sending money to foreign countries. Through this process, it seems apparent that some of SCOTUS are compromised, acting in fear. Very recently, Tucker Carlson interviewed FTX's Sam Bankman-Fried from prison. This light-hearted interview with the crypto guru, who is facing 25 years for fraud, happened when it happened for a reason. It is shedding light on America's corrupt judicial system, as the SCOTUS situation is doing simultaneously. I predict it will be shown that Bankman-Fried was actually railroaded and will be pardoned by Trump. The spotlight is currently being shown on America's judicial system, its corruption, and its need to change. As the media funding starts to dissipate, expect the propaganda and manipulation to change in how it occurs. Without the platforms to push lies and disinformation as they could for years, with such broad, sweeping capacity, the realm in which the deep state manipulation exists will change. The corrupt rhinos, neocons, and liberals can't refute the claims Doge has made about government corruption and waste, so they must attack Elon Musk on a personal level instead. If you can't attack the message, then you must attack the messenger. Desperately, the media and social media influencers are now claiming Elon Musk isn't really very smart, and he isn't really very creative, and he isn't really very important. Ironically, the same media and social media influencers were fanboys of Musk right up to the point he announced his interest in buying Twitter, a complete reversal of opinion overnight. They claim Musk and his staff shouldn't have access to citizens' personal information that tens of thousands of government workers have access to every day. Suddenly, personal privacy has become paramount to them. When Trump spoke at the address to the nation, all the liberals could do was hold up signs saying false and lies, and this is not normal. They're right about one thing: this is no longer the norm. Speaking the truth hasn't been the norm for a very long time. With polls stating 3/4 of Americans approve of what Doge is doing, and 3/4 of Americans approve of Trump's address speech, it is clear the only recourse the deep state has left is to attack not only the messengers, but also the recipients of the messages. Attack the receivers of the truth, ridicule them for believing the message, cause the receiver of the truth not to trust himself, to question his own discernment, to make himself believe that he's foolish and stupid, muddy the waters, so that one might have a reason to question their common sense. Blackpill by demanding unreasonable things on an unreasonable timeline. Be careful who you trust. Their intentions may not be sincere. They may appear to align with your thoughts and beliefs, but their intention is to pull the rug out from underneath you. They may push for the whole truth to be revealed at once, seeming to care about the truth, but really wanting the chaos that would ensue. They may try to convince you that you didn't really hear what you heard, or try to convince you that you misinterpreted it. It's like the serpent in the Garden of Eden, trying to convince Adam and Eve of what God really said of the tree of life. Their intention is to enter the room, drop a grenade, and leave. We must continue to think for ourselves. We must develop discernment, but that development only comes through exposure to the lies of the world. For many Americans who are just waking up, their discernment is still at a toddler's level. This must be developed and nurtured. This will keep us as a society from falling back into the same hole we just crawled out of. We must not only learn discernment in the messages we receive, but discernment in whom we trust. We must trust ourselves and not be shaken by a bot-driven insult we receive in the comments section of a social media post. We must disengage from anyone who tries to tell us what we really heard, but we must not be offended by the truth teller when the truth teller shows us how we've been led astray. We must be able to stand on our own. We must be able to recognize when we are being manipulated. We must be comfortable when the majority doesn't agree with us. Our desire for the truth to be fully revealed cannot be to validate ourselves and to make others look bad. The desire for the full truth to be revealed can't be just so we can say, "I told you so." Our need for the full truth to be revealed must come from the unselfish desire that others know the truth and that justice prevail. Nothing more and nothing less. As much as we would like people to recognize that we've been right about it all the past 8 years or so, it's more important that the public hears the truth at a pace that they are able to accept. This might require a little more patience. And that is my friend Erik Carlson once again. Now, I'm almost certain that, I don't know if I read this piece already. Did I read this piece already? We're about to find out. We read it already. I think we're good to go on old Erik Carlson. So let's see what else we got. Do I have any more pieces that I wrote? I do not know. Let's find out. readingepicthreads.substack.com, which is live even as we speak. Ooh, I do like Sigma Game. Let's find out. The problem with this Substack platform is it doesn't sort your articles and your podcasts. It's pretty jacked up, dude. But at least, I don't know. Like, silver is the key. Joe Lang. When is Joe Lang going to write another piece? God, wouldn't it be funny if... Ooh, perfect. Okay. I've got a new column from readingepicthreads.substack.com entitled MicroStrategy, Macro Swindle. I'm so clever. From readingepicthreads.substack.com, MicroStrategy, Macro Swindle. Michael Saylor is a creepy, dead-eyed con man, by Patrick Gunnels. Michael Saylor is often presented as a tech entrepreneur, corporate visionary, and Bitcoin evangelist. His admirers hold him up as a financial genius who saw Bitcoin's potential before Wall Street caught on. In reality, he is a serial fraudster, a pathological gambler, and an opportunist who built his career on deception, self-dealing, and outright fraud. Long before Saylor rebranded himself as the corporate face of Bitcoin maximalism, he was best known for cooking the books at MicroStrategy, misleading investors, and crashing his own company's stock in one of the most infamous financial collapses of the dot-com bubble. The grift never stopped, it just evolved. What we are witnessing with Saylor's Bitcoin gamble is not a revolutionary financial strategy. It is history repeating itself. The original Saylor fraud, how he nearly destroyed MicroStrategy. Before Bitcoin, before his obsessive rants about monetizing energy, Michael Saylor was just another dot-com era CEO riding a speculative wave. His company, MicroStrategy, specialized in business intelligence software, and like many tech firms of the late 1990s, saw its stock price skyrocket as investors poured money into anything with a .com attached to it. By early 2000, MicroStrategy's stock had surged to nearly $300 per share, giving the company a market capitalization of $25 billion. But it was all built on lies. On March 20th, 2000, the SEC charged Michael Saylor and two other MicroStrategy executives with securities fraud, accusing them of systematically overstating the company's financial performance. For 2 years, the SEC's investigation revealed that MicroStrategy had falsified its revenues and profits, misleading investors about the company's true financial health. To put it bluntly, Saylor was lying about how much money his company was making. The SEC found that he had fraudulently inflated revenues by prematurely recognizing contracts that had not yet been paid, artificially boosting earnings reports. By manipulating MicroStrategy's financial statements, he misled investors into thinking the company was far more profitable than it actually was. Once the fraud was exposed, MicroStrategy's stock imploded. It collapsed from $300 to $33 in a single day, erasing $11 billion in shareholder value overnight. Saylor, who had been worth $13.6 billion at his peak, saw his net worth vaporized in hours. Rather than fight the charges, Saylor and his executives settled with the SEC, agreeing to pay $11 million in fines. Saylor himself was personally ordered to pay $8.3 million in penalties and was forced to restate MicroStrategy's financials, revealing the company had never been profitable to begin with. The fallout from the scandal was catastrophic. MicroStrategy became a poster child for the excess and deception of the dot-com bubble, and Saylor was left in disgrace. His days as a high-flying CEO appeared to be over. But Michael Saylor is not just any fraudster. He is a survivor. And like all great con men, he knew that the key to escaping his past was to find a new story, a new pitch, and most importantly, a new set of suckers. The Bitcoin pivot, a new con for a new era. By 2020, MicroStrategy was a stagnant company with no real future. Its stock had been flatlining for nearly 2 decades, and the company was struggling to remain relevant. Saylor, realizing that his old tricks were no longer working, saw an opportunity in Bitcoin. The narrative was perfect. He could pivot MicroStrategy into a Bitcoin company, portray himself as a visionary investor, and repackage his reckless gambling as corporate strategy. In August 2020, he began purchasing Bitcoin using MicroStrategy's cash reserves, later borrowing billions to buy even more. This was not a thoughtful investment strategy. It was a leveraged, high-risk bet Disguised as a genius move. By going all in on Bitcoin, Saylor created a hype cycle driving both Bitcoin's price and MicroStrategy's stock higher. Investors, desperate for exposure to Bitcoin, began piling into MicroStrategy's stock as a proxy investment. The more he hyped Bitcoin, the higher MicroStrategy's stock went. And the higher MicroStrategy's stock went, the more leverage he could use to buy more Bitcoin. This is not a financial strategy. This is a pyramid scheme. At the same time, Saylor began aggressively promoting Bitcoin maximalism, crafting an ideological framework that demonized all other assets and painted Bitcoin as the only legitimate store of value. His rhetoric took on a cult-like tone, describing Bitcoin as the most powerful property in the world, digital energy, an immortal, indestructible asset that will replace all money, real estate, and gold. This is not rational investment advice. This is a con man selling a dream. Saylor knew exactly what he was doing. By turning Bitcoin into a religious crusade, he could ensure that his followers would never sell, never question his motives, never doubt his wisdom. He wasn't just another corporate investor. He was now a prophet. The creepy, dead-eyed fraudster. If Saylor's financial history wasn't disturbing enough, his personal demeanor should be. There is something uniquely unnerving about his robotic speech, his unblinking gaze, and his eerily rehearsed talking points. When watching him speak, it becomes immediately clear that he is not operating on normal human instincts. He speaks in scripted loops, recycling the same phrases over and over again. His presence is deeply unsettling, not because of charisma, but because of the complete lack thereof. The most effective con men are the ones who can fake warmth, authenticity, and sincerity. Saylor, however, has none of these abilities. Instead, he exudes an almost alien detachment from reality, a dead-eyed persistence in repeating his dogma. This is not normal behavior for a corporate executive. This is the behavior of a cult leader. The reckless gamble that will collapse. At some point, all bubbles pop, and Saylor's Bitcoin gamble is no exception. MicroStrategy's balance sheet is now effectively tied to Bitcoin's price, and if Bitcoin ever drops below a critical level, the company will face forced liquidations. The real tragedy is that Saylor does not care. If MicroStrategy collapses, if millions of retail investors lose their money, if employees lose their jobs, he will walk away unscathed. Saylor has already personally cashed out millions. If Bitcoin's price crashes, he will still be rich. It is his followers, the people who believed in his nonsense, who will be left to suffer. The grift is coming to an end. Michael Saylor's entire career has been a case study in deception, reckless gambling, and financial manipulation. He committed securities fraud in 2000, lied about MicroStrategy's financials, and nearly destroyed his company. He reinvented himself as a Bitcoin guru, using cult-like rhetoric to lure in gullible investors. He leveraged his company's assets to make reckless Bitcoin bets, ensuring that when the collapse comes, it will be catastrophic. This is not a visionary. This is a con artist. Michael Saylor is not a financial genius. He is a creepy, dead-eyed con man who has fooled a new generation of investors into believing that this time his gamble is different. It is not. It never was. And when it all collapses. Sailor will once again walk away, leaving the wreckage behind, just like he always has. And that's me writing at readingepicthreads.substack.com. That is readingepicthreads.substack.com. Because it's the freaking best. Got to go there, guys. All right, what else we got? I think that might be the whole show. What do you think? 49 minutes, long enough for a Reading Epic Threads episode? I'm working on another piece right now about a guy named Max Keiser. I'll just read it to you. This piece is called Max Keiser is a demented psychopath with an IQ of 72. Max Keiser is one of the most unhinged, delusional, and deranged figures in the financial world, a man whose entire persona is built on a volatile mix of hysterical Bitcoin maximalism, conspiracy-laden ranting, and embarrassingly low intellectual depth. His rabid, almost foaming at the mouth obsession with Bitcoin, his complete inability to process nuance or opposing viewpoints, and his cult-like devotion to narratives that collapse under even the lightest scrutiny all paint the picture of a man whose grasp on reality is tenuous at best. For years, Keiser has paraded himself as a financial guru despite his track record being one of catastrophic failure, intellectual incoherence, and an embarrassing lack of actual financial understanding. His behavior is erratic, his predictions are laughable, and his IQ, based on observable evidence, appears to hover somewhere around 72. Low enough to disqualify him from even basic analytical reasoning, but just high enough to string together loud, meaningless catchphrases to manipulate his devoted cult of financially illiterate followers. A history of failure, Keiser's record of incompetence. Before reinventing himself as Bitcoin's screaming court jester, Max Keiser's career was a string of failures, scams, and failed attempts to position himself as a financial expert. Keiser's biggest financial venture, the Hollywood Stock Exchange, HSX, was an absolute disaster. He founded the company in 1996, promising a revolutionary platform that would allow people to trade movie stocks tied to the box office performance of Hollywood films. However, the business model was fundamentally flawed, and the entire venture became a joke within the industry. HSX never achieved mainstream success and was ultimately sold for a humiliatingly low amount. Keiser was forced out of his own company, unable to make it profitable or viable. Despite this failure, he continued to present himself as a financial visionary, despite his only major business being a massive embarrassment. This pattern of failure and reinvention would define his entire career. Keiser failed at actual finance, so he pivoted to media grifting, where he could pretend to be an expert without having to prove anything. The Bitcoin maximalist cult, Keiser's most insane reinvention. Keiser's true grift began when he latched onto Bitcoin like a parasite, realizing that he could exploit the crypto world's low information fanatics to build a following. Unlike actual crypto pioneers who approached blockchain technology with curiosity, innovation, or nuanced understanding, Keiser immediately descended into religious fanaticism, treating Bitcoin as a deity rather than a financial instrument. He promotes Bitcoin with an intensity that borders on psychosis. He dismisses all other cryptocurrencies as scams, despite having no technical understanding of them. His arguments are completely devoid of logic, relying instead on loud, repetitive sound bites. If you were to take every single cult leader in history, inject them with cocaine, remove any semblance of intelligence, and then give them a Twitter account, you would get Max Keiser. His deranged, borderline violent devotion to Bitcoin makes even the most radical religious fundamentalists look reasonable by comparison. Instead of engaging in rational discourse, Kaiser screams at people who disagree with him, declares that all non-Bitcoiners deserve financial ruin, pushes increasingly insane conspiracy theories about governments, banks, and rival cryptocurrencies. This is not the behavior of a rational financial thinker. This is the delusional ranting of a man whose intellect is completely insufficient to engage with complex ideas. One does not need formal testing to determine that Max Kaiser's IQ is hovering dangerously close to the level of mild intellectual disability, his complete inability to construct a logical argument, his infantile emotional outbursts, and his consistent failure to understand even basic financial concepts all point to a man whose cognitive abilities are severely lacking. One, he does not understand basic economic principles. Kaiser speaks about Bitcoin as if it exists in a vacuum, failing to grasp how macroeconomics, monetary policy, and regulatory frameworks interact with financial markets. Two, he is incapable of handling debate. When challenged, Kaiser does not respond with counter-arguments. He responds with screaming insults and bizarre rants. Three, his predictions are always wrong. Like all low IQ con men, he conveniently forgets his past failures and moves on to the next loud claim. Four, he relies on slogans, not analysis. His communication style is childlike, a stream of consciousness, meaningless catchphrases rather than structured reasoning. Kaiser's IQ, based on available evidence, is insufficient for complex reasoning, but perfectly suited for shouting nonsense on social media. It is not enough to say that Max Kaiser is merely stupid. He is also deeply unwell. His behavior does not merely suggest ignorance, it suggests severe psychological instability. His Twitter presence reads like the unfiltered diary of a lunatic. He actively encourages financial ruin for anyone who does not worship Bitcoin. His demeanor is not merely aggressive, it is pathological. Lack of empathy. Kaiser openly celebrates financial suffering for anyone who does not buy Bitcoin. He does not see economic hardship as a problem to be solved. He sees it as deserved punishment for non-believers. Pathological lying. Like all grifters, Kaiser makes grandiose, unverifiable claims about his own financial wisdom while conveniently ignoring his history of failed ventures and bad predictions. Narcissistic delusions. He presents himself as a prophetic genius, despite being nothing more than a loudmouth media personality with no accomplishments. Unhinged aggression. He does not engage in debates. He attacks, screams, spews vitriol at anyone who questions him. This is not normal behavior for an adult, let alone someone claiming financial expertise. Kaiser is not merely a fool. He is a deeply unstable individual who is actively dangerous to those who take him seriously. He is a laughing stock and his followers are victims. His entire career has been a tragic joke. He failed as a financial entrepreneur, failed as a rational investor, and has now reinvented himself as a cult leader for low IQ Bitcoin fanatics. His understanding of finance is non-existent. His ability to engage in meaningful discussion is zero. His personality is a chaotic mix of lunacy, aggression, and delusion. If there is a single person in the financial world whose credibility is completely non-existent, it is Max Kaiser. He is a demented psychopath with an IQ of 72, a clown masquerading as a thinker, and a carnival barker preying on the gullible. To take him seriously is to declare yourself intellectually bankrupt. To follow him is to join a financial cult, and to believe his nonsense is to reject reality itself. And that's what I have to say about that scumbag. And just for grins, I'm going to hop on YouTube and find you some of his most deranged rants. Hold for processing.
Let me explain something to you right now. Okay, here's a $10 bill. This is garbage. This is garbage. Your people in South Africa, you have your rand, right? That's going to zero. That's going to zero. This is going to zero too. Euros are going to zero. The yen's going to zero. The Chinese currency is going to zero. It's all going to zero against Bitcoin. If you don't understand that yet, you're going to be impoverished. You're going to be on the street. You're going to be begging. You're going to be out of business. You're going to be toast.
Max, do you know that it's a criminal offense to tear up?
Do you know that with the Bitcoin I have, I can buy any freaking senator or congressman I want. I make the laws. He who has the Bitcoin makes the laws, Rand. We're not going to just sit around and let the goddamn congressman tell us what to do. We've got the capital. We make the laws. We've got the Bitcoin. They don't. We got it. They don't. Do you understand?
What is the value proposition of Bitcoin? It fulfills all the four major categories under Aristotle's proposition for good money. What is value? It's the portability, divisibility, fungibility, and scarcity and desirability. It fulfills all those characteristics.
I would debate the scarcity, but it doesn't have any real money. Must be a commodity in and of itself before it's money. It must have actual use. No, it's not.
It is.
Okay, so you tell me what can you do with your Bitcoins right now?
Sound.
What?
I have a Bitcoin debit card. I can go anywhere in the world and buy
spending
stuff.
it.
That's right.
What can you do?
But Peter, I believe
I can secure immutably for all time in history data. On a blockchain, the Bitcoin block is the biggest blockchain in the world. Every 10 minutes, it's totally verified. No, yes, you do.
You can
because otherwise, you have the ability of others to come in and change that database. Databases, you can have any database product can come along and secure data, but it's not immutable and it's not stored.
No, it has to have
secure because of the technology of proof of work.
It has to have an actual
every 10 minutes.
Apart from its
securing data is useful. Securing
what data are you securing?
Any data that you would
want.
What
data are you securing?
Financial data, mortgage data.
But on your personal data, if I have one,
my birth certificate, my personal data, my verification of who I am, so I don't need Equifax to sell my data and lose my data and fuck my data. I can have my data on a private key and say, this is me. It's immutable. It's every 10 minutes. It's verified. That's who I am. Give me my fucking money.
You don't need Bitcoin either.
Yes, you do, because it's the most secure. It's the only secure database that's ever been invented. That's the technology. You fail to understand that it's a new technology that is as profound as the printing press or the electric light bulb. You're comparing it to things that you shouldn't be comparing it to. It makes no sense. You're talking nonsense.
Yeah, this is
it's a brand new breakthrough in technology. Your kids are going to be wondering why their dad didn't see the value. They'll be like, Dad must have been on drugs because he never saw the value.
This is a cult of Bitcoin. This is your guru. This is the type of reaction that you're going to get. I mean, you might as well be Sung Young Moon or something, or just don't drink any.
Let me help you help yourself.
All.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, to be fair, an actual payment system with scalability would have value in itself. Bitcoin does not have scalability. Therefore, it can't be a payment system. Therefore, it can't be a store of value. Bitcoin wouldn't scale to be the financial system for a medium-sized city. And layer 2 is just recreating the banking system on top of it. That's the only argument you'll ever need to talk about Bitcoin. That's it. 7 transactions per second. We're done here. Moving on. So I just wanted to get that out there. I just want to get that concept out there because it is the most important concept in the whole damn world right now. No other concept matters right now. They're trying to replace our financial system. Our financial system will be replaced with digital money. That digital money must be decentralized and it must be scalable. And it can't be Bitcoin. You're dead if it's Bitcoin. All right, that's all I had to get to today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Don't forget readingepicthreads.substack.com. There is a live version of this show that happens every single day on that platform. Erik Carlson, ERIKC, ericc.substack.com. Let us pray. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all evil spirits who prowl about the world seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. I love you all. Thank you so much for being here. I'll see you tomorrow.
I will be the greatest president that God ever created.